South African Airways is one of the biggest and oldest companies in Africa and was established some 880 years ago. This is an airline that has gone through so many ups and downs since its establishment on 1st February 1934. The airline has been able to survive some of the tougher times, from hostility from other African countries, international restrictions, and many limitations, to become the first African airline to join Star Alliance. This is a company that owns outstanding subsidiaries. This is again a company that had the greatest number of passengers carried in Africa from the year 2000 to 2017. It is so sad that a company of this pedigree had to struggle through a series of unprofitable years to the extent that it had to file for bankruptcy in 2020. What really happened to South African Airways? Stay tuned and let's get into it. My name is Bernard and you are watching African Dream Motivation. On 1st February 1934, a new chapter was opened in Africa. An airline was established, becoming the first passenger airline on the continent. South Africa became the hub of the African aviation industry. As the airline was experiencing tremendous growth, the Second World War began, and this halted all its operations. Irrespective of the travel bans and restrictions, the airline survived. It grew through the mid-20th century, becoming a competitive market contender during the jet age, that is from 1953 to 1973. During the period between 1974 and 1983, the airline began experiencing greater hostility in Africa. Some African countries denied South African Airways the use of their airspace. Therefore, they needed to operate long bypasses, which cost the company huge sums of money. The system was such that European airlines were allowed to fly over Africa when flying to South Africa, but it was impossible for a South African airline to fly over key countries in the African aviation industry. All these sanctions and hostility was as a result of the unbearable ruling of the Apartheid government in South Africa. Many black South Africans were living in fear and panic, and to make things worse, there were many cases of human rights abuse against the Apartheid government. This made the government very unpopular. This brings us to our next chapter: international opposition against the Apartheid government. A little backstory here. During the early 1960s, the pressure on the Apartheid government for freedom of South Africans became increasingly high. Many black South Africans were now becoming vocal and began demanding freedom and fairness. This led to the arrest of many leaders, including Nelson Mandela, who was sentenced to life imprisonment. Many countries around the world condemned the actions of the Apartheid government, but it was to no avail. The next move was the imposition of sanctions to force the hand of the government. After this, the United States, United Kingdom, and 23 other nations passed laws placing various trade sanctions on South Africa. Gradually, sanctions against the Apartheid government began spreading like wildfire. Investors no longer looked at South Africa for opportunities, and the economy began collapsing. From 1984 onwards, according to the Knight, because of the disinvestment campaign and the repayment of foreign loans, South Africa experienced considerably capital flight. The net capital movement out of South Africa are as follows. In 1985, 9.2 billion rands were moved. In 1986, 6.1 billion rands were taken out of the country. In 1987, 3.1 billion rands were taken out. And finally in 1988, 5.5 billion rands were moved outside South Africa. The capital flight triggered a dramatic decline in the international exchange rate of South African currency, the rand. The currency decline made imports more expensive, which in turn caused inflation in South Africa to rise to a very steep 12 to 15% per year. To make matters worse for the South African aviation industry, the United States Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act of 1986 banned all flight by South African-owned carriers, including South African Airways. This was a big blow to the airline. So much money in revenue were lost. In 1987, South African Airways service to Perth and Sydney in Australia had to end due to the Australian government's sanctions and impositions on apartheid. These sanctions continued until Nelson Mandela was released on 11 February 1990, bringing an end to the apartheid ruling. A recovery then followed. After a long battle with sanctions and restrictions here and there, South African Airways began operations once more. They started service to formal and new destinations worldwide, especially in Africa and Asia. Some of these new destinations were a flight to Miami International Airport non-stop with Boeing 747-400 routes in 1992. They were also able to re-enter Australia as they were doing previously. Again, in 1992, they had a code-sharing agreement with American Airline and Air Tanzania. This was just the beginning to many code-sharing agreements and alliances. On 24 April 1994, a feeder airline service of South African origin began operating by the name South African Express. South African Airways held a stake of 20%. This new airline took over some of South Africa's low-density domestic routes. The growth of South African Airways in the mid-1990s caught the attention of airline giants Lufthansa. In 1995, Lufthansa started a code-sharing agreement with South African Airways, and this was the game changer that took the airline to a different level. By 1996, South African Airways had employed 11,100 people, of whom 3,100 were engineers. The airline owned 48 aircraft and served 34 destinations worldwide. Following the internet bubble that changed the world forever, South African Airways tapped into the digital world of opportunities and started online ticket sales. This was a move that explains how visionary the airline was. With all this in place, the airline was still seeing many unprofitable aircraft and destinations. A move needed to be effected. Fear of bankruptcy. Even though revenue was flowing in, huge capital expenditures made profitability goals unrealistic. In 1998, the airline had to stop its services to Copenhagen Airport due to cost reduction measures put in place. With situations getting out of hand, a new president and CEO had to be appointed. An American, experienced in managing airlines, was appointed. He was in the person of Coleman Andrews. His appointment came as a result of concerns raised by researchers of Transnet who discovered the following issues with the airline. 1. Failure to fly on time. 2. Unfriendliness and minimally trained staff. 3. Poor food. And finally, South African Airways fares being 12 to 25% above its competitors. Unfortunately for the airline, these were the very things people consider when choosing an airline for a flight. With these underlying problems, an expert was really needed. Before Andrew Coleman was appointed to manage South African Airways, he was credited with rescuing World Airways from the brink of bankruptcy earlier in the decade. This simply cements the fact that he was the man for the job. His first 18 months as CEO saw the company's market value increase fivefold. This was indeed a great turnaround, but more needed to be done to save the company. Transnet was the parent company of South African Airways, and to help the airline survive, it entered into a sale agreement with Swiss Air. This deal resulted in Transnet selling 20% of its shareholding of South African Airways to Swiss Air. This sale was however repurchased by the South African government in 2002 after Swiss Air filed for bankruptcy. At this point, South African Airways was strategically positioning itself to dominate Africa by purchasing more aircraft in the early 2000s. In March 2002, South African Airways spent $3.5 billion to request Airbus in an attempt to overhaul its fleet. However, these orders delayed since the airline industry was still struggling to be on its feet after the September 11 attack in the United States. Later in the year 2002, South African Airways made a bid for a 49% stake of Air Tanzania. It was a great strategy to expand the company's operation, but in another twist, it was a bankruptcy sentence they were moving towards because, over the course of the decade, the airline has spent heavily on rebranding and the acquisitions of dozens of aircraft. This was the same situation Swiss Air got itself into after purchasing a 20% stake of South African Airways in 1999 and other airlines, but shockingly had to file for bankruptcy on 1st April 2002. It was indeed an extremely risky path to choose. To make it even worse, South African Airways wasn't financially stable. Even though revenue were coming in, the airline was still struggling to come closer to profitability. The intention to merge with Air Tanzania failed when new management took over. Gradually, South African Airways began receiving massive acceptance worldwide. In 2005, it became the first non-Saudi airline to fly a direct Hajj service to Medina in Saudi Arabia. Also, the airline started a 4-time weekly Johannesburg-Accra-Washington DC service with a Boeing 747-400. All this was just a pace setter for something even bigger. A big win and a fall-off. On 31st March 2006, the South African government succeeded in separating South African Airways from its parent company Transnet. This was to help the airline become independent to be able to accomplish certain milestones. Exactly 10 days after this separation was successful, South African Airways joined Star Alliance. South African Airways became the first African airline to join the alliance. It was a big win for South Africa and Africa as a whole. This was followed by an 18-month comprehensive restructuring program with the aim of making the airline profitable. Things were going according to plan, with the company cutting costs and working hard strategically. But in 2010, a scandal exposed the airline that changed everything forever. This scandal was about a critical situation of conflict of interest. The company sought to recover an amount of $4 million from the then CEO, Kaya Ingwala, for allegedly spending the money on his friends and awarding business deals with organizations and individuals in which he had an interest. This was followed by a series of corruption allegations, especially during the administration of the former president of South Africa, Jacob Zuma. The president, Jacob Zuma, and the South African Airways board were implicated in a number of corruption-related controversies. Notable among these allegations were concerns raised about the corrupt and irregular activities by then South African Airways non-executive director and Jacob Zuma's appointee, Duku Imyeni. These activities are widely blamed for the airline's financial difficulties. There have also been issues of racism associated with the airline. The South African Airways have been accused of rejecting white cadet pilots on the ground of race who met the educational and physical criteria. The Bild newspaper claimed that the airline had an online application system that have been programmed to reject white applicants. This issue was investigated by the South African Trade Union Solidarity, which took legal actions against the airline, denting its reputation. Even though the management of the airline rejected these accusations, the newspaper agency stood their grounds. All these irregularities, coupled with other factors, led to serious financial difficulties. Financial difficulties. By the year 2006, South African Airways was considered one of the biggest airlines in Africa due to a huge fleet of aircraft. But looking a little deeper, the airline was not consistent with making profits. In 2007, the airline made a loss of 610 million rand, and by 2008, the loss had even increased to 973 million rand. These unprofitable years brought so much pressure on the airline. The airline struggled to maintain an international standard and couldn't afford to appeal to passengers anymore. Therefore, on 16th August 2012, South African Airways ended its Cape Town landing route after operating for 20 years. This was due to declining passenger numbers and increasing airport taxes. It was the beginning of the end. The airline began shutting down many of its non-stop services. It happened again in 2013 and even in 2015. Their services to Beijing and Mumbai were also ended. In June 2015, the acting CEO stated that London, Hong Kong, Munich, Frankfurt and Perth were the only profitable long-haul routes. All others were loss-making. From their financial statements, it was very clear that from 2012 to 2017, the airline didn't make any profit. It was only making losses. These losses resulted in the company reducing its fleet and cutting off 23% of its flights in September 2017. This drastic decline prompted the creditors of the airline to come knocking for their money. Standard Chartered Bank was the first bank to appear in June 2017 to request its loan repayment. The South African government came to the rescue by providing 2.2 billion rand to settle the debt. Citibank refused to extend its loan facility to the airline. Other financial institutions came knocking, resulting in another 7.7 billion rand payment at the end of September 2017. In any business establishment, when creditors come at the same time demanding their loan repayment or withdrawal of their credit support, it becomes very difficult for the entity to sail through. The decline in the company's operation made South African Treasury seek a bailout of 100 billion rand from the Public Investment Corporation of South Africa, which controls government pension funds. While all this financial blunder was ongoing, South African Airways was hit by strike action by unions which began on 15 November 2019 to 22nd November 2019. The strike was reportedly to have costed the airline 50 million rands per day. At this stage, it was very clear that the South African Airways had become insolvent. And the moment insolvency set in, filing for bankruptcy becomes the next reasonable step. Bankruptcy. On 5th December 2019, South African Airways filed for bankruptcy and it was announced by the government of South Africa. This was because the airline had not turned a profit since 2011 and due to the financial pressure it was encountering, it had even run out of money. This bankruptcy protection announcement followed with the airline suspending several routes in January 2020. In an attempt to have a grip of recovery, the airline decided to replace some of its old and unprofitable fleet with a fleet of Airbus A350-900s, which is considered a modernized aircraft and hopefully may turn profitable. As the government of South Africa was doing everything possible to take the airline out of bankruptcy, COVID-19 pandemic took over the world. The possible end was even closer and more visible than ever. The impact of COVID-19 pandemic. For an airline that has been in business for more than 80 years, the South African Airways has encountered multiple economic recessions which they overcame. You can talk about the World War II, the A2N2 pandemic of 1957, the A3N2 pandemic of 1968, the 1980s Apartheid international sanctions, the 2003 coronavirus called SARS, 2013's Ebola, and many other financial breakdowns. Even though the airline survived all of these, the situation was very tough this time, considering the company's position financially and how the COVID-19 pandemic caught the world by surprise. Remember that this is an airline struggling to pay its employees, struggling to repay its loans, and making losses year in, year out. Their only hope was the government, who occasionally provided financial support to keep the airline running. In April 2020, the airline made a request for further emergency financing due to the COVID-19 pandemic. This was the time the government was really struggling to finance its day-to-day operations. Therefore, in response to the airline's request, the government of South Africa announced that it will stop funding the airline with immediate effect. This made things even worse for South African Airways, because if there are no money coming in for the day-to-day running of the airline, then the next step will be liquidation, meaning the airline will have to shut down. It came as a shock to the world when South African Airways announced its plan to lay off all remaining staff by the end of the month, which was April 2020. As of 1st May 2020, the situation was so bad that the airline was unable to pay its staff. The unaudited financial statements of the South African Airways showed that the airline made losses of almost 16 billion rands in the last 3 years. Also, the airline had received 50 billion rands from government assistance between 2004 and 2020. The Parliament of South Africa were fed up with taxpayers' money being put in the rescue of South African Airways with nothing good coming out of it. On 2nd May 2020, what many people feared would happen came to pass. The government of South Africa announced that South African Airways will be ceasing operations after 86 years of its service. The liquidation process was set to begin on 8th May, but however, the airline was in great debt and its employee hadn't been paid. This became a legal battle between the liquidators and the workforce. In July 2020, the creditors voted to accept the restructuring plan, allowing the airline to avoid liquidation. A full domestic network was to be reinstated by December 2020. After a lot of struggle to secure funding to begin operations, once again, the airline suspended all of its operations until critical funding could be received. Relaunch. With a lot of thinking and reconsiderations going into the funding, the government of South Africa agreed to sell its majority stake to Takasco Consortium, which involves airline partners such as Global Airways. The consortium now owns 51% of South African Airways, while the government maintains a 49% stake. The deal was expected to be completed in early 2020. Today, South African Airways is back in the air, trying to pick up the pieces and dominate Africa once more. This is one of Africa's greatest companies that has refused to concede defeat. Even though it is not in the best of places, it still has what it takes to rise up and dominate again.
Thank you so much for making it to the end of this video, and I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know what you think in the comment section. Kindly subscribe and click on the notification bell so that you don't miss any new video we upload. Until we meet next time, have a nice day.